Let's talk about tight end for the New England Patriots, Hunter Henry, and the thigh bruise that he sustained while playing against the Kansas City Chiefs last Sunday. So I know what you're thinking. What's the big deal? The guy got a bruise on his thigh. People get bruises all the time. He's a football player. He should be able to bounce back, no problem. But let's talk a little bit more about why that may not be the case when we talk about bruised muscles, and especially in the realm of sports medicine. So when a muscle gets bruised, there is a small amount of bleeding that occurs within the muscle. The medical term for a bruise is just called a hematoma. So technically what this is an intramuscular hematoma, which is basically just a small amount of bleeding and then a subsequent bruise that formed within the muscle itself. And so again, we think, what's the big deal? It's just a small bruise. Well, unlike your skin, muscles have to actually stretch and contract and recoil and perform when you're out on the football field. So what we need to make sure is that we respect the fact that there's a small amount of swelling and fluid collection that builds up within the muscle. Remember that the muscle only has a finite amount of volume that it can sustain. So if you fill that amount of volume up with things like blood and fluid and cells that are trying to migrate to the area to help the healing process, that's going to create this really stiff feeling. So that's why it's really important, as soon as an athlete sustains a small bruise, to start range of motion right away, because otherwise all that blood will start to pool and then the muscle will become very stiff, and so will the area around it, and then it makes it even more painful and harder to get the ball rolling. So muscle bruises are not uncommon in contact collision sports, and even sometimes we'll see people on the baseball or softball field that will get hit by a line drive with that baseball or softball and sustain a bruise to the muscle. Now, when we talk about the thigh itself, we're specifically talking about the quad muscles, right? So when we take a look at the way that your quad muscles are set up, there's a muscle on the outside of your thigh called your vastus lateralis, and that's typically the muscle that's involved, and that's the one that's shaded a little bit more in purple further below on the diagram. So again, we're asking this quad muscle to be able to extend your knee, to help you walk, to give you a little bit more push off when you run and jump, right? So if we start to balloon up, like overflow a water balloon to that area, it's going to be very difficult for that athlete to perform. So we really need to make sure that we start, like I said, range of motion right away. And then I'm not a big gizmos and gadgets kind of guy in our clinic, but this is one of the few times that I would start to consider some things like electrical stimulation. We start to think about other modalities that can just help to jumpstart the healing process. The good news is that this type of injury usually isn't a long-term recovery. And in fact, sometimes what can happen is if the athlete feels ready, they can actually go back into the same game. And in between games, they just need a little TLC and a little bit of recovery as well. We can do things like soft tissue and dry needling once some of the swelling is. The medical term for a thigh bruise is a quad contusion. So as we can see from this picture, they're usually pretty big. They're usually pretty painful, especially if they're going to be holding somebody out from a game, even temporarily, even if they can go back in the same game. Oftentimes can be caused by direct contact, like in a tackle in football or rugby. Sometimes it'll be caused by like a slash injury when we think about things like hockey or lacrosse. And then sometimes, like in this picture, it seems like this was caused by a softball or a baseball that came in and made contact with this person's thigh. Now, we talked a little bit about some of the recovery, but we can see how it would be quite painful to be able to walk or run on this. Now, usually this tends to be more of a self-limiting and pain-limiting condition, meaning that there is a small amount of healing that typically occurs within, depending on the size of it, anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. So after that initial swelling has calmed down, then it's just a matter of how well the athlete can tolerate whatever moves they need to do. So in Hunter Henry's case, he needed to be able to run, jump, catch, slide on that thigh, and he was able to do that a little bit later on in the game. And then, like we mentioned earlier, just some TLC just between the New England games is really what he'll probably need. One of the potential complications for a muscle bruise is something called myositis ossificans, and that's when a small amount of bone forms within the muscle tissue itself. We're not exactly sure why this occurs, but one of the theories out there is that calcium is a component within muscle cells, and calcium also is one of the precursors and components of bone tissue. And so the thought is that if somebody sustains a bruise within the muscle, calcium leaks out and stays within that concealed area. And then what happens is if enough calcium is able to hang out there for long enough, it can bind together and form a small amount of immature bone. And then that's what we can see on an x-ray. And if we have somebody with myositis ossificans, it's a very painful lump in there because that bone is still new and usually the muscle underneath it is still healing. So it's this really hard lump, and it does feel like a little calcium deposit in there because that's kind of what it is. We're not really sure why certain athletes develop this and others don't. There's even some research that showed that if a surgeon goes in and removes that bone growth, sometimes that bone actually reforms again. So again, not really sure why this occurs, but definitely something to keep in the back of your head when we deal with an athlete with a muscle bruise.